Karen hadn't left her house in 3 days. She'd called in sick to her part-time job at the real estate office, ignored her phone, and lived on delivery food and regret. The resignation letter sat on her kitchen table, written and rewritten a dozen times, but never sent. On Sunday afternoon, her doorbell rang. She ignored it, as she had all the others, but the ringing persisted. Finally, she peered through the peephole and nearly stumbled backward in shock. Mike Chen stood on her doorstep, holding a covered dish. Karen's first instinct was to pretend she wasn't home, but something in his patient posture told her he'd wait. With trembling hands, she opened the door. "Hi, Karen," he said simply. "I brought soup." She stared at him, unable to form words. This was the man she'd humiliated, the man whose morning swim had triggered her spectacular downfall, standing on her doorstep with homemade soup. "I don't understand," she finally whispered. "Can I come in?" he asked gently. "I think we need to talk." Karen stepped aside, and Mike entered her immaculate living room. He set the soup on her coffee table and sat down on her pristine white couch as if they were old friends. "I know what it's like to lose control," he said without preamble. "To feel like everything you've built is falling apart." "I haven't lost control," Karen said automatically, then caught herself. "I mean, I lost my first patient when I was a resident," Mike continued, "a 7-year-old girl with a heart defect. I was so focused on following protocol, on doing everything by the book, that I missed what was right in front of me. She died because I was too rigid to adapt." Karen sank into the chair across from him. "I'm not a doctor. I haven't cost anyone their life." "Haven't you?" Mike asked gently. "Mrs. Patterson told me she's been afraid to garden because she doesn't want to upset you. The Henderson kids don't play in their yard anymore because they're scared of getting in trouble. You've made people afraid to live in their own neighborhood." The words should have made Karen angry, should have triggered her defensive instincts. Instead, they felt like a key turning in a lock, opening something she kept closed for years. "I just wanted to keep things nice," she said, her voice breaking. "I wanted to protect what we had." "I know," Mike said. "But somewhere along the way, you started protecting the rules instead of the people they were meant to serve." Karen looked around her perfect living room, at the HOA documentation neatly filed in labeled binders, at the violation notices she prepared but never sent. "I don't know how to be anything else." "Sure you do," Mike said. "You just forgot." He pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. Karen from 4 years ago at the neighborhood block party, laughing with a group of children, her face relaxed and genuinely happy. "I remember that day," she said softly. "The Martinez kids were teaching me how to hula hoop." "You were fun," Mike said. "You were part of the community instead of standing apart from it." Karen felt tears building in her eyes. "I can't undo what I've done. People hate me." "People are hurt," Mike corrected. "There's a difference. Hurt can heal if you're willing to do the work." "What work?" Mike smiled. "Well, you could start by not resigning from the board." Karen stared at him. "You know about the resignation letter? Dolores mentioned it, and I think it would be a mistake." Karen Pemberton stood at her perfectly manicured lawn's edge, clutching her HOA violation notice clipboard like a weapon of mass destruction. Her eyes narrowed as she watched her neighbor, Mike Chen, cannonball into his own swimming pool with a triumphant whoop that echoed across Willowbrook Estates. The splash sent water cascading over the decorative stone border, and Karen's left eye began its familiar twitch. "That's it," she muttered, her voice dripping with the kind of righteous indignation that could curdle milk. "This ends today." She marched across the property line, a boundary she'd measured with a surveyor's precision 3 times in the past month, and positioned herself at the pool's edge. Mike surfaced, water streaming from his salt and pepper beard, grinning like a man who just won the lottery. "Morning, Karen," he called out, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in her steely gray eyes. "Beautiful day for a swim, isn't it?" "Michael Chen," Karen announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been HOA president for 6 consecutive years. "I'm ordering you to exit this pool immediately." Mike's grin faltered. "I'm sorry, what now?" Section 4.7 of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Covenant clearly states that recreational water activities must not exceed acceptable noise levels between the hours of 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. on weekdays. Karen consulted her clipboard with the solemnity of a Supreme Court justice reading a verdict. Your cannonball at 8:47 a.m. registered as a disturbance. You're in violation. Mike floated there, mouth agape, looking like a confused sea lion. Karen, this is my pool. In my backyard. On my property. Property that exists within the governed boundaries of this association. Karen shot back, her voice rising an octave. Property that I, as elected president, have the duty to protect from noise pollution, aesthetic degradation, and general neighborhood disruption. You want me to get out of my own pool? I want you to respect the community standards we've all agreed to uphold, Karen declared, pulling out her phone. If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities. Mike's wife, Lisa, appeared at the sliding glass door, coffee mug in hand. What's happening out here? Karen's trying to evict me from my own pool, Mike called out, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that would have been comical if Karen hadn't been dead serious. Lisa stepped outside, her expression shifting from confusion to barely contained laughter. Karen, you do realize that Mike owns this pool, right? Like, he paid for it, installed it, and maintains it. Ownership doesn't supersede community responsibility, Karen replied, her chin jutting forward with determination. I've documented 17 separate noise violations from this pool in the past month alone. 17? Mike sputtered. I've used it maybe 5 times. Quality over quantity, Michael. Each instance represents a deliberate disregard for your neighbor's peace and quiet. That's when Karen made the call that would change everything. She dialed 911 with the conviction of someone reporting a bank robbery, completely ignoring Lisa's growing smile and Mike's incredulous stare. Yes, I need to report a homeowner in violation of community noise ordinances. Karen spoke into the phone. He's refusing to comply with association regulations and is creating a public disturbance. As she waited for the police to arrive, Karen felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with upholding order. She had no idea that this moment would mark the beginning of her downfall, or that the responding officers would find the situation so amusing that their laughter would echo through the entire neighborhood. Word traveled fast in Willowbrook Estates, faster than Karen had anticipated. By noon, her phone was buzzing with calls from neighbors who had heard various versions of the morning's events. Some were supportive, praising her dedication to community standards. Others were less enthusiastic. Karen, honey, came the voice of Dolores Hartwell, her longtime ally and fellow HOA board member. Maybe you went a little overboard this morning? Karen stood in her kitchen, staring out at Mike's pool where he was now doing peaceful laps, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. Dolores, if we don't enforce our standards consistently, they become meaningless. You know that. But calling the police, over a swim, over a pattern of behavior, Karen corrected. This isn't about one incident. It's about setting precedent. But even as she spoke, Karen felt something gnawing at her confidence. The officer's laughter had stung more than she wanted to admit. She'd been so certain of her position, so confident in her authority, that their reaction had caught her completely off guard. Her phone rang again. This time it was Janet Morrison from 2 streets over. Karen, I just heard what happened. Are you okay? I'm fine, Karen replied, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Just doing my job. Your job isn't to harass people in their own backyards, Janet said gently. Mike's a good neighbor. He's never caused any real problems. Any violation of the covenants is a real problem, Karen shot back. But the words fell hollow even to her own ears. After hanging up, Karen found herself walking to her living room window that faced Mike's backyard. She watched him swim his steady laps, his form efficient and graceful. For a moment, she tried to see the situation through someone else's eyes, a successful doctor, stealing a few minutes of peace before heading to the hospital to save children's lives, being confronted by his neighbor for the crime of swimming in his own pool. The thought made her stomach clench uncomfortably. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. She opened it to find Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived next door to Mike. Karen, dear, I hope you don't mind me stopping by, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice gentle but firm. I wanted to talk to you about this morning. Karen stepped aside to let her in, immediately defensive. If you're here to lecture me about, I'm here because I'm worried about you, Mrs. Patterson interrupted. I've lived next to Mike for 12 years, and I've never once been bothered by his pool. In fact, I enjoy watching him swim. It's peaceful. Karen's jaw tightened. The covenants aren't suggestions, Mrs. Patterson. They're binding agreements. But they're meant to protect our quality of life, not diminish it, the older woman replied. Mike isn't throwing wild parties or disturbing anyone. He's just trying to stay healthy and find a few moments of quiet in his day. Rules are rules, Karen said, but her voice lacked its usual fire. Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment. Karen, when was the last time you did something just for joy? Something that made you happy without serving some greater purpose or maintaining some standard? The question hit Karen like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. When was the last time? When had her life become so consumed with monitoring and controlling and enforcing that she'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be? I should go, Mrs. Patterson said softly. But please think about what I said. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for our community is to remember our humanity. After Mrs. Patterson left, Karen stood in her empty house, surrounded by perfectly organized rooms and HOA documentation, feeling more alone than she had in years. For the first time since moving to Willowbrook Estates, she wondered if she'd confused being needed with being respected, if her role as protector had somehow transformed her into something she never intended to become. Outside, Mike finished his laps and climbed out of the pool. He waved at Mrs. Patterson, who was watering her garden, and she waved back with a smile. It was such a simple, normal interaction, but it highlighted something Karen couldn't ignore. She was the only one who saw a problem where everyone else saw a neighbor living his life. That evening, Karen sat in her study, surrounded by HOA regulations and violation notices, trying to write her incident report. But every time she put pen to paper, she heard the officer's laughter echoing in her mind, saw Mrs. Patterson's concerned face, remembered Mike's confused expression when she'd ordered him out of his own pool. For the first time in her 6-year tenure as HOA president, Karen Pemberton wondered if she might be wrong. The emergency HOA board meeting was called for Thursday evening, just 3 days after what the neighborhood had dubbed Poolgate. Karen sat at the head of the conference table in the community center, her usual stack of perfectly organized documents spread before her, but her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled through them. The other 4 board members filed in with expressions ranging from concern to openly skeptical. Dolores Hartwell, usually Karen's strongest supporter, wouldn't meet her eyes. Tom Bradley, the treasurer, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Sarah Kim, the secretary, appeared professionally neutral, but Karen could sense the tension in her posture. Thank you all for coming, Karen began, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. I called this meeting to address the recent incident with the Chen property and to clarify our position on covenant enforcement. Karen, interrupted Bob Martinez, the newest board member, before we go any further, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. You called the police on a man for swimming in his own pool. I called the police because of repeated covenant violations, Karen replied, but her usual fire was noticeably absent. It's our duty. Our duty, Sarah Kim interrupted, her voice sharp, is to serve the community, not terrorize it. Do you have any idea what people are saying about us? About you? Karen's chest tightened. What are they saying? Tom Bradley slid a folder across the table. We've received 17 formal complaints about your behavior. 17, Karen. All in the past 3 days. Karen opened the folder with trembling fingers. The complaints ranged from requests for her resignation to accusations of harassment and abuse of power. But it was the final letter that made her blood run cold. A petition signed by 43 residents calling for her immediate removal from the board. Karen's voice faltered. This is a coordinated attack on the board's authority. No, Dolores said quietly. This is the community telling us that we've lost our way, that you've lost your way. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She looked around the table at faces that had once supported her, had once praised her dedication and attention to detail. Now they looked at her with something she'd never seen before: disappointment. "I've given 6 years of my life to this community," Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've protected property values, maintained standards, ensured that this neighborhood remained a place people wanted to live. By making it a place where people are afraid to live," Bob replied. "Mrs. Patterson told me she's scared to plant flowers in her front yard because she doesn't know if they'll meet your approval. The Hendersons are considering moving because they're tired of getting violation notices for their children's toys being visible from the street." Karen felt the room spinning slightly. "Those are legitimate concerns. The covenants clearly state." "The covenants," Sarah interrupted, "are meant to serve the community, not the other way around. You've turned them into weapons instead of guidelines." "I've enforced them equally and fairly," Karen protested, but even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true. She thought of Mike Chen, swimming peaceful laps in his own pool, and felt a wave of shame wash over her. Tom Bradley leaned forward. "Karen, we need to discuss your future on this board. The community has lost confidence in your leadership." "You're removing me?" Karen's voice was barely audible. "We're asking you to consider stepping down," Dolores said gently. "For the good of the community, for your own good." Karen stared at the petition in her hands, at the names of neighbors she'd known for years, people she thought she was protecting. Mrs. Patterson's signature was there, along with Mike and Lisa Chen's. Even the Hendersons, whom she'd always considered allies, had signed. "I need time to think," Karen said finally. "Of course," Sarah replied. "But Karen, we need an answer by Monday. The community deserves to know what's happening." After the meeting, Karen sat alone in her car in the community center parking lot, watching through her windshield as the other board members drove away. She felt more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. Surrounded by the very community she devoted herself to serving. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the news about the board meeting. Hope you're okay. Mike Chen." Karen stared at the message for a long time. The man she humiliated, whose peaceful morning she'd disrupted, whose privacy she'd violated, was checking on her well-being. The kindness of it was almost unbearable. She typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on, "Thank you." But as she drove home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook Estates, past houses where families were settling in for the evening, Karen realized that her thanks weren't enough. She had broken something in this community, something that might take years to repair. The question was she brave enough to try? "The community wants me gone." They signed a petition. "The community wants change," Mike said. "That doesn't mean you have to disappear. It means you need to transform." Karen felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. "How?" "By remembering that your job is to serve the community, not control it. By asking what people need instead of telling them what they can't do. By swimming in your own pool instead of policing everyone else's." "I don't have a pool," Karen said with a shaky laugh. "Metaphorically speaking," Mike grinned. "Though if you want to use mine sometime, you're welcome to. Just no cannonballs before 9 a.m. For the first time in weeks, Karen genuinely smiled. "I'll try to restrain myself." As Mike prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Karen, the board meeting is tomorrow night. Whatever you decide, remember that the community needs leaders who care about people, not just property values." After he left, Karen sat in her living room, staring at the resignation letter. Then she picked up her phone and called Dolores. "I want to withdraw my resignation," she said. "But I want to propose something different. A complete restructuring of how we operate." "What kind of restructuring?" Karen looked out her window at Mike's pool, where he was doing his evening laps. "The kind that puts people first." The next morning, Karen walked to Mike's backyard and knocked on his gate. When he answered, she was holding a small gift bag. "What's this?" he asked. "Pool noodles," she said. "I thought maybe you could teach me to swim. I never learned as a kid." Mike's face broke into a wide grin. "I'd be honored, but fair warning. I'm a terrible teacher when it comes to anything that isn't surgery." As Karen stepped through the gate into Mike's backyard, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. the possibility of redemption. The board meeting was still 12 hours away, and she had no idea if the community would accept her proposal for change. But for the first time since moving to Willowbrook Estates, Karen Pemberton was more interested in building bridges than enforcing boundaries. The question was, would that be enough to save not just her position, but the fractured community she'd spent years trying to perfect? 20 minutes later, 2 police cruisers rolled into Willowbrook Estates with the kind of casual authority that made Karen's chest swell with vindication. Officers Martinez and Thompson emerged from their vehicles, their expressions professionally neutral until they took in the scene. A middle-aged man floating peacefully in his backyard pool, while a woman in a pristine white tennis outfit stood guard beside it like a sentinel. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez began, his voice carefully controlled. "You called about a disturbance." Karen straightened her shoulders, clipboard at the ready. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. I'm Karen Pemberton, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. This man," she gestured dramatically toward Mike, who had wisely remained in the pool, "is in direct violation of our community noise ordinances." Officer Thompson glanced at Mike, then at the pool, then back at Karen. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but could you clarify what exactly the violation is?" "Excessive splashing, unauthorized cannonball entry, and general disregard for the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties," Karen recited as if she were reading from a legal brief. "I have documented evidence of repeated infractions." Mike, who had been silently treading water during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Officers, I was just swimming in my own pool, in my own backyard, on my own property." The 2 officers exchanged a look that Karen completely missed, too focused on presenting her case to notice the slight upturn at the corners of their mouths. "And you want him to get out of his own pool?" Officer Martinez asked slowly. "I want him to respect the community standards that make this neighborhood a desirable place to live," Karen replied with the fervor of a televangelist. "If we allow one person to flagrantly disregard the rules, what's to stop others from following suit? Soon we'll have pools full of teenagers, pool parties at all hours, and complete chaos." Officer Thompson walked over to the pool's edge and looked down at Mike. "Sir, how long have you lived here?" 12 years, Mike replied, still floating. "Built this pool 3 years ago with all the proper permits and HOA approval." "And how often do you use it?" "Maybe once or twice a week when the weather's nice. Usually just a quiet swim in the morning before work." Karen interjected, "The morning hours are specifically designated for peaceful neighborhood activities. Swimming constitutes recreational water sports, which should be confined to appropriate timeframes." Officer Martinez was now openly struggling to maintain his composure. "Ma'am, what time would be appropriate for a man to swim in his own pool?" "Between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays, and with prior notification to adjacent property owners," Karen replied without hesitation. "It's all outlined in Section 4.7 of our covenant." "Prior notification?" Officer Thompson's voice cracked slightly. "Like, he needs to ask permission." "Not permission," Karen corrected. "Notification. A simple courtesy that demonstrates respect for the community." Lisa had been watching from the patio, but now she stepped forward. "Officers, I'm sorry you had to come out here for this. My husband was just taking a quick swim before work. He's a pediatric surgeon, and this is literally the only time he has to exercise." "A pediatric surgeon," Officer Martinez repeated, looking at Mike with new respect. "And you're telling him he can't swim in his own pool?" Karen sensed the tide turning against her, but pressed forward with the determination of someone who had never backed down from a fight. Professional credentials don't exempt anyone from community standards. If anything, someone in a position of responsibility should set a better example. That's when Officer Thompson lost it. A small chuckle escaped, then another, until he was openly laughing. Officer Martinez tried to maintain his professionalism, but couldn't suppress his grin. "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said, wiping his eyes, "we can't arrest a man for swimming in his own pool." "Then what about the noise ordinance?" Karen demanded, her voice rising. "The splashing, the disruption." "What disruption?" Officer Martinez asked, looking around at the quiet neighborhood. I don't see any other neighbors complaining. Karen's face flushed crimson. They're afraid to speak up because they know I'll handle it. That's what leadership means, taking action when others won't. But as she spoke, something shifted in the officer's expressions. The humor faded, replaced by a weary recognition of something they'd seen too many times before. Karen didn't notice, too caught up in her own righteousness, to see that she'd just revealed more about herself than she intended. The morning sun climbed higher, and Karen felt the first crack in her absolute certainty. But she was too proud to back down now.